And now I'd like to welcome witnesses for our first panel. Now, there was an update to our agenda. Dominique Cowett, professor and chair of Asian and Indo-Pacific Studies at the Université de Montréal, is not attending. There's job action at his university, and he's not permitted to take part in this evening's event. We do have Fen Osler-Hampson, Chancellor's Professor and Professor, Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, Carleton University. Maybe that's Paterson School. Is that correct, or Patterson? Patterson, okay. And Mr. Gordon Holden, Professor and Director Emeritus, University of Alberta, China Institute. Gentlemen, you each have up to 5 minutes for an opening comment, and after which we will then proceed to questions. Would you like to begin, Mr. Hampson?
Certainly. J'aimerais remercier le président.
I would like to thank the chair and committee members for giving me the opportunity to join you this evening.
My remarks on China's approach to global governance and its implications for Canada. The foundations of the current order were built after the Second World War and are anchored, as we all know, in the United Nations and the Bretton Woods system. For many years, Canadian foreign policy under both liberal and conservative governments was based on the premise that including China in the institutions of global governance would encourage it to become a responsible member of the international community and socialize it to adopt Western norms and values. Today, I would suggest we need to revisit that premise. In addition to its apparent steps to acquire a dominant position in the world militarily and economically, China has embarked on a quest to acquire a dominant role in global governance. The first pillar of that strategy is to strengthen its position and leadership within existing international institutions, particularly within the UN system and its specialized agencies. The second pillar is a more ambitious quest to build a new economic order centered on the BRICS, which one day, and I stress one day, may parallel the Bretton Woods trading and monetary system. To achieve this goal, China, is using its wealth and power through its $1 trillion Belt and Road Initiative that I think you're all familiar with. But it has developed a number of other new initiatives, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, which are also part of that blueprint for a new world order. And more recently, its much-touted Global Civilization Initiative and Community for a Shared Future. But its ambitions don't stop there. The Human Rights Council, as we all know, has been one of China's targets in the UN system. UN peacekeeping is another area where China is expanding its role and influence. Over the past 3 decades, China has provided 50,000 peacekeepers to some 30 UN peacekeeping missions. It's the second largest funder of those missions, and today contributes more peacekeepers than any other permanent member of the Security Council. Chinese personnel and staff also occupy many critical positions in the UN Economic and Social Council. It would also like to fill the leadership position of the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, which today is filled by a French national, and that probably isn't going to change for a bit. Why does it matter? Why does this matter? Over the years, UN peacekeeping and peace-building operations have played an essential role in fostering democracy, advancing human rights, and contributing to developing open markets. China's reputation and influence in those missions will move the goalpost away from democratization and good governance. China is also actively expanding its influence in bodies like the International Telecommunications Union, the International Organization for Standardization, the International Electrotechnical Commission, and the Third Generation Partnership Project. These are all vital standard-setting bodies for a wide variety of highly innovative internet-based technologies, which, as we now know, are the focus of intense competition between China, the United States, and its Western allies. Why does this matter? A dominant position in these organizations, especially the key global technology standard-setting bodies, gives a country control at the leading edge of the technological frontier, especially in setting technical protocols, standards for data exchanges, formatting, communications network security, and performance, thus conferring a competitive advantage to its technology sector. The second pillar of that global governance strategy is centered on creating its own separate international institutions and global forums, such as expanding the BRICS, which has added 6 new members. China's also keen to replace the American dollar's dominance as a global reserve currency and the economic clout that comes with it. Now, that's not going to happen anytime soon because China would have to lift its capital restrictions for the renminbi. But never say never. The world is changing. The renminbi's global use is being aided by renminbi clearing banks, the People's Bank of China's bilateral swap lines, and China's cross-border interbank payment system.
Mr. Hansen, we've come to our 5 minutes. If you have a concluding paragraph, and then perhaps
I do.
Work the other points in there. Thank you.
So what does this mean for Canada and Canadian interests? First, we must become more active in offsetting Chinese influence, not just here in Canada, but internationally and in those institutions where the Chinese are making a real bid for power and influence. Secondly, many developing countries are interested in the BRICS because there is widespread dissatisfaction with the governance structures of existing international institutions. Accordingly, Canada should be a strong champion of governance reform to counter influence in those institutions. Thirdly, China, and this is my final point, Mr. President, we should be under no illusion that China will support our positions and aspirations for leadership in the UN and other bodies. That's not the reason to throw in the towel or walk away from our international commitments and responsibilities. It does mean that we're going to have to work much harder to make new friends and build new international coalitions beyond our traditional Western support group to advance our values and interests.
Thank you, Mr. Hampson. We'll now turn to Mr. Holden for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Hardy, for the opportunity to speak to the House of Commons China Committee on Canada's Indo-Pacific Strategy. Je suis prêt à répondre aux questions en français.
I will answer questions in English or French.
Since the public release of the Indo-Pacific Strategy, but we've already seen significant changes in the strategic environment. Before directly addressing Canada's Indo-Pacific Strategy, I'd like to first examine some of the risks of open conflict that characterize today's Indo-Pacific. That complex nature of the region is revealed in several ways. First, it is counterintuitively perhaps characterized by the general absence of interstate armed conflict, with only one major intrastate conflict present at the moment, civil war in Myanmar. But there is an arms race underway in Asia. 26% of the global arms purchases in the Indo-Pacific region, not counting the United States, where it would be 65% of total arms purchases. These are the heavy battalions, which means that open warfare in East or Southeast Asia, should it come, risks being especially violent and destructive. The Indo-Pacific does contain a number of latent conflicts, some of which could produce major wars that would profoundly affect Canada and Canadians. Just as in Europe in 1913, the current lack of interstate warfare can lead to a false sense of security. Let me just touch upon very briefly those risks. First, Taiwan, a leftover and unresolved conflict from the Chinese Civil War of 1946-49. Formerly autocratic Taiwan, now democratic, is vulnerable to attack by People's Republic of China, either by direct assault or by a wide range of gray area pressure tactics. While President Biden has publicly stated the U.S. will come to the defense of Taiwan in the event of a Chinese assault on the island, there are some doubts in the Taiwanese public regarding the willingness of Washington to defend the island. The precipitous U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and the failure of U.S. Congress to authorize additional funding for Ukraine and Taiwan feeds this uneasiness. Members of the House of Commons are well aware of the limitations of public polling, but some polls have indicated a slight majority of Americans would not support a U.S. military action in defense of Taiwan. Unlike Ukraine, where Russia had a 4-to-1 advantage in population, in the case of Taiwan, China has a population 60 times larger. Only direct U.S. military intervention, in my view, could prevent Taiwan being overwhelmed in the case of an attack. And of course, there's also insecurity, even instability in this U.S. presidential election year. Historically, I would submit, whether during the Roman Empire or history of more modern circumstances, it has been chaos or weakness in the metropole, in the center, when distant provinces or allied states have been overwhelmed. There's also the frozen conflict in the Korean Peninsula. 80-year division remains a latent but increasingly dangerous threat. Pyongyang's nuclear weapon capacity is growing in both quality and quantity, including a range of delivery options. I happen to believe, based on limited visits to North Korea, that Kim and his generals want to die in bed, like most dictators. But the DPRK's reach, as it increases, and as the ROK, Japan, and U.S., they must now plan on how they might defend against a conventional attack on the Korean Peninsula or even a more ambitious regional targeting by Pyongyang. United Nations Security Council consensus on isolating the regime is broken, with Russia engaged in huge arms purchases from the North Korean regime and China harassing Canadian efforts to reduce the sanctions. Canada is working to enforce those sanctions, but it's problematic when 2 UN Security Council members are either directly undermining the sanctions regime or undermining its enforcement. I could also speak about the South China Sea, a topic that I've probably spent too much time for someone who comes from a landlocked province. China-India border, which I believe to be somewhat less hazardous, given that I fail to see the net interest of either party engaging in a broader conflict. U.S.-China relations remain fraught. Each views the other as a medium to long-term threat, and the armed forces of both countries have shaped their forces and their weapon systems towards the possibility of a war between the most powerful militaries on Earth. But we did see in late 2023 an effort by both Washington and Beijing to reestablish a high-level dialogue aimed at reducing the risks of hostilities. The U.S. is greatly distracted by wars in Europe and the Middle East, despite decades-long efforts to disengage the Middle East and West Asia in favor of the Indo-Pacific. They just get closer to being finished in the Middle East, and they get dragged back. That's a consistent theme. I'll now come to 5 conclusions, more directly aimed at Canada's IPS. It was overdue, but its release a year ago was a net positive step. While the conflicts in the region are latent as opposed to actual, they're deep, and pressure is building, particularly with regard to Taiwan, the Korean Peninsula, and the South China Sea. Third, political turmoil is a genuine risk in the United States in 2024, not certain, but a risk, and foreign policy will not be untouched. Evidence of U.S. paralysis or a new administration's reduced interest could encourage adventurism. Fourth, Canada will remain, on balance, a minor factor in the Pacific region, but major events in the region will profoundly affect Canada. That's the harsh reality for us. Modest influence, but potentially great impact. And then finally, with a dynamic Indo-Pacific, and I've noted some of the ways in which that region has shifted over the course of the last 12 months, and with the risk that the latent security challenges could morph on short notice into immediate security challenges, a public update of the IPS should be undertaken on an annual or at least biannual basis. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Holden. All right, we'll now turn to our first round of questioning, and we'll begin with Mr. Seaback for 6 minutes or less.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Hampson, in February of 2022, you actually came and testified at the Standing Committee on National Defense, and you made a comment about, to the extent of that Canada's military was understrength, and that Canada's armed forces might not be up to the task of confronting what's going on now. The Indo-Pacific strategy that the government's released, it has the following sort of phrase in: Canada is stepping up as a reliable partner in the region to promote security and stability across the region and at home. Canada will increase our military engagement and intelligence capacity as a means of mitigating coercive behavior and the threats to regional security. Has your assessment of the status of Canada's military to meet these threats changed since you sort of talked in February of 2022?
Well, I forgot what I said 2 years ago, and I don't know whether I should be flattered that somebody was paying attention. I probably should be. I don't think the delta on that has changed very substantially. Yes, there are commitments underway to add to the strength of our Navy, or at least replace old stock. But we have yet to, shall we say, really put any of that new capital into the water. I think there's a lot of positive rhetoric in the Indo-Pacific strategy around boosting our defense capabilities. But at the end of the day, one has to ask, where's the beef? And I would say, it's still more hat than cattle.
And that's some of the complaints that I'm seeing and hearing about the Indo-Pacific strategy. It talks a lot about things, but the actual deliverables either aren't there when they're specified, but even most things aren't specified. I was reading an article by Hugh Stevens from the School of Public Policy in Calgary, and he says, well, it's expected that some details will be lacking when a new comprehensive strategy is unveiled. The lack of specificity and details on the paths to implementation on many of the IPS's elements is concerning. And that's my concern. It seems like it's a lot of talk, but no actual mechanisms within the strategy to measure the deliverability of the things that they've said. Would you share that concern or any concerns you have around that as well?
I think at the end of the day, people will look, and our allies will look at our capabilities, which have not increased substantially in the past 2 years. Yes, we're doing things to upgrade surveillance in the Arctic, and that's important. That's important for the defense of North America. But we're not moving, for example, in the same direction that our Australian friends are moving. They are committed to increasing their defense spending by some 4%. I think that's correct. Or to bring it up to 4% of GDP with their proposed acquisition of new nuclear-powered submarines. Not suggesting we should necessarily move in that direction, but we're playing a catch-up game, and we're falling farther and farther behind, I'm afraid, even with the new commitments that the government is making.
I'm just going to switch gears a little bit to business. In your book, you mentioned Canadian relations with countries of the region are underdeveloped and our businesses underperform in their markets. Can you expand a little bit on that in the minute and 40 seconds we have left?
I'm not sure which book you're referring to. Is that the Braver series with Derek Burney, Brave New Canada?
New strategies for Canadian engagement with a critical region.
Yeah, okay. The short answer is we've got a long way to go. The Indo-Pacific document or paper is aspirational. And one of the concerns I have, yes, the business community is suddenly beginning to pay a lot more attention because I think they see the writing on the wall in terms of protectionism south of the border. Yes, there may be some new opportunities, but at the end of the day, if we're really going to boost our economic fortunes, we have to engage with the major emerging economies of the Indo-Pacific. And that's a horn that I and others have been blowing for many, many, many years that preceded the Indo-Pacific strategy statement, which, as Gordon said, was long overdue. But you're not going to achieve that overnight. It's going to require a substantial commitment on the part not just of the business community, but Canada's leaders. more than Team Canada missions, but real follow-up. And one of the concerns I have is, as we see developments south of the border, the prospect of an election that may bring a former president to power, is that's just going to suck the oxygen out of the Indo-Pacific strategy. And it's going to be difficult for our leaders who need to be courting the Americans to at the same time be jumping on airplanes to go south, to go west. That's also true, by the way, of the business community.
With that, thank you, Mr. Seaback, for your questions. We'll now go to Mr. Fragasiadis for another 6 minutes.
Thank you to both of you for being here tonight. Professor Hampson, there's a lot in your nuanced statement that you leave us with, but I always like to turn it back to witnesses. If you were to share with us, sir, or emphasize rather, a key point that you want this committee to really take in, what would that be? What is the critical thing that you want us to keep in mind as a committee on these issues?
Well, my comments were very much focused on the Chinese game that is being played in existing international institutions. They're putting a lot of their people into key positions. You see that in the staffing of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, but it goes well beyond there. I think, number one, we got to put more people in the field. Some of the things the Chinese are doing aren't necessarily bad, and they may well be in our interest. But at the same time, it's also a competitive game, highly competitive game that's being played. And that means having more people in the field, more people in New York. I think we have 24 officers there right now. That's grossly understaffed compared to other countries of similar size to ours. And one of my colleagues just did a terrific report on Canada at the UN. And one of their principal findings, based on extensive research, is that we don't have enough people in the field. And we don't have enough people at the specialized agencies watching what's going on and advancing our own interests. So it's a real capability challenge, and that means also funding those missions properly.
It's an interesting point. Some have said recently, in fact, as we know, that Canada should pull out of the United Nations. What do you make of comments like that?
It's not in our interest to do so. We will then, as I suggested, really be leaving the ground to our enemies, our adversaries, our competitors, who will fill the void. We're already seeing that. The Americans are experiencing that because they were pulling back. And as I've suggested, when it comes to promoting democracy and human rights, one of the principal avenues for doing that has been through peacekeeping, peace-building missions in which Canada helped write the resolutions, the enabling resolutions, put people in the field to do those jobs. It also creates, those missions, by the way, create an enormous space for our civil society actors who are much more important than, in some ways, than what our officials do, because they're on the ground. They're promoting democracy. They're promoting human rights. Well, if you're not there, it's goodbye.
Right.
And it goes well beyond that to the technology frontier, as I suggested, where those international organizations that I mentioned play a key standard-setting role. And we got to be there.
Thank you very much. Professor Holden, if I could take a comment that Professor Hampson just put to us, and it's been made before, that while there is plenty of tension, understandably so, between Canada and China, there are areas of cooperation. What areas of cooperation should we continue to look at? My mind goes to climate change, for example.
Climate change makes good sense. There are areas, China's 20% of the world's population, so there are going to be areas where we have common ground. Health would be another. Unfortunately, it's been damaged in the eyes of the Canadian public due to some of the factors involved in the pandemic, vaccines that didn't go forward, suspicion about the origins of COVID, etc. So that is still an area that we can't ignore. The next pandemic is more likely to emerge in China than anywhere else. When I was the deputy head of mission, I was there during SARS, and we had no medical expert. I was going to the briefings by the World Health Organization every day, trying to make sense out of the technical terminology. So when I came back a few years later to be Director General in Ottawa, I said, we need a health agency doctor en place who speaks Chinese. And we did so. But the person was removed before the pandemic. So we had someone there one time that was useful but not essential, and then we didn't again have someone there. So little things like that can be hugely, hugely important. And I think there's also areas in biodiversity in that broad environmental category. China's almost the same size as we are. They have a lot of species at risk, and they have a lot of clout in the UN system. I think this COP meeting in Montreal was a success overall. It might be hard to think, but actually even at a time of fraught relations bilaterally, I understand that worked reasonably well. It's a hard-nosed assessment of where we have an interest and where it happens to align. Some things won't with a Chinese interest. That can work. Finding those areas is not always easy, but it can be done. And that's why I look forward to at least a better dialogue at senior levels. It can be behind closed doors. It can be public. But we can't go on indefinitely. When our allies, the Australian Prime Minister, the Germans, the French, the Americans, the Brits and others, all of our G7 and Five Eyes partners have been engaging at high levels with China. Now, I'm not saying it's all our fault. Chinese are punishing us. But we need to fix that. We kept our embassy, not a perfect analogy, we kept our embassy in Berlin open until September 1st, 1939. And in other words, I'm a former diplomat, you talk. And if that utterly fails, you turn it over to the other side, to the military. But we need to be talking. A dialogue from a distance by loudspeaker doesn't work. We need to be there on the ground and having regular contact in both directions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Pregastatos. We'll now go to Mr. Bergeron for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, sirs. We're happy to have you with us here this evening. Thank you for contributing to our reflection on Indo-Pacific strategies. I'll ask you some questions, and either of you can answer, or both. In this strategy, Canada says that it will continue to defend the universal human rights and will support the Uyghurs, Tibetans, and other ethnic and religious minorities, without saying how it will defend the rights of Uyghurs, Tibetans, and other religious minorities. One would assume they're referring to China, but the strategy also evokes the possibility of opening a dialogue with states that don't share our values. Do you see that as a contradiction? That is a more firm and aggressive policy on China, but a more permissive strategy towards other countries in the region that may not respect our values that we hold dear. It's always a temptation to talk only with countries that have the same values as ours, like within a family. But in my opinion, there are undemocratic countries, perhaps 100 of countries, that have human rights policies that are great. But curiously, it's more important for me to have for us to have dialogues with countries that have problems with human rights, even if we're not on the same page. But the simple fact that we're talking, it means that there is at least a chance. China is difficult. It's a country with great international weight, with a long tradition. There are many years of contact with the Chinese, and the human rights is a difficult issue, but it's necessary. And on occasion, we sometimes talk with the Chinese. For example, We saw it with CETA 20 years ago on prison management. It seems impossible, but I was at our mission, and part of the problem was a lack of knowledge. Some of the faults of the Chinese prison system were improved upon. They will always imprison people who wouldn't be in prison in Canada. The list of offenses is long in China. But optimistic contact, if with China, if we can change the policy even just 1% or part of a percent, it is useful. But do I think that tomorrow things will improve significantly with the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, and other religious minorities? Not at all. But at least contact and dialogue in the hopes that there will be change. If we don't engage, it is certain that there will be stagnation.
No. Je comprends.
I understand your response.
Talking is not the same as capitulation, and sometimes the two get confused, particularly in public discourse. I would agree with everything Gordon said, but I would add two caveats. One is we shouldn't go soft. Diplomacy is about hard talk. It's not just sweet talk. And I think when it comes to China, as we saw with the declaration against arbitrary detention, we're much more effective when we engage in team talk, which is to say we build coalitions, informal coalitions, and deliver the same message at the same time to, in this case, the Chinese, because they don't like to be called out in numbers. And that requires a very adroit diplomacy. It requires a strong diplomatic leadership, and it requires consistency. You know, you don't deliver the message once, you got to deliver it many times over.
And picking up on your answers, should we show the same firmness with the states with which we want to open a dialogue?
Right. With that, Mr. Bergeron, your 6 minutes have gone by. We'll now go to Ms. McPherson for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and Happy New Year's to all my colleagues that I'm seeing for the first time. Your comments have been very interesting. Thank you very much for both of you for being here. And one of the things that I'm hearing from you is that, you know, as China is increasing its influence around the world, both diplomatically, you know, in terms of development, in terms of utilizing the tools within the multilateral institutions, that they're gaining more influence. Now, this is happening at the same time that the influence that Canada has in the world is diminishing. So, you know, we've seen, and I don't blame the current administration solely. This is the last 20 years that we have seen a diminishment in our diplomatic resources and what we do with our diplomacy. We've seen a diminishment within our development dollars and how we spend money and what that looks like. And in even, as you mentioned, our participation in multilateral institutions like the United Nations, you know, those areas where, you know, Canada can't even get a Security Council seat any longer. I'd like to get a better sense of what the implications of that are. And then if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to pass it to both of you, but if you wouldn't mind also just touching upon the idea that this is the current context we're in, but we are in a context now where we could have a Trump presidency which pulls the U.S. even further back. And to be honest, we have a potential federal government in Canada that has spoken about pulling back from the world stage in multiple ways. What is the implications of that, and what does China see when these things are happening? Perhaps I could start with you, Dr. Holden. As an Albertan, sorry, Professor, but as an Albertan, I have to nod to my fellow Albertans. No, despite the hat and the cow, the beef
Alberta, I mean, you can't take me out of Alberta, but you can't take the Albertaness out of me. It's very true. The world is shifting in profound ways. It's the fact that it's rather gradual. It doesn't mean that it doesn't happen swiftly. When I left Beijing, and it sounds like forever now, but in 2004 to go to Taiwan, the Chinese economy was roughly 1/12 of what it is today, 12 times in roughly 20 years. And while there's lots of serious doubts about the Chinese economy going forward, the idea that it's going to collapse, that it's not going to grow, I think is assuming the global economy is stable, is something that's not going to occur. But we have seen a relative diminution in U.S. strength and in the strength of Western countries generally. G7, if you just look at a percentage of GDP, there's no sign that change is going to. We're going to be in a different world. We are in a different world of diminishing influence. Plus, the Asia Pacific region doesn't have a NATO. The committees, groups that we belong to, be it Francophone or Commonwealth, don't have as much clout there. We have influence, but our cultural mindset, in my opinion, is still very much oriented towards Europe, towards the United States. It's easy to say, as it says in the IPS, 2/3 of the population's there in Asia that is growing quickly, but it understates, in my view, the growth of China. Yes, we can send our business people to Southeast Asia, to ASEAN countries, if we wish. But when they arrive there, they're going to find the infrastructure is often built by China. For the great majority of those Indo-Pacific countries, excluding the United States, China's the number one trading partner. So you can move from Burlington to Kuala Lumpur, open an office there, you may be doing way more China business than you were doing back home. So the idea that, China's has half of the Asian economy right there, and that reality that anybody's been an adult since 1945, there's been a situation where the West, particularly the United States, has been in a dominant leading position. I don't think we can automatically assume that. They're not going to go away. And China's not going to be all-powerful. But we're now in a place where U.S. can be challenged, and where U.S. may choose not to engage. And that creates real difficulties for us who have lived snugly along that U.S. border and are deeply dependent on that U.S. market. But the idea that we can not engage as an option is not there. We are... U.S. is about 24% dependent on foreign trade. We're closer to 60%, China's somewhere in between. So the idea that we can maintain our prosperity without being engaged globally is just not there. And if that's where the growth is, that's where we need to be.
Okay. Mr. Hampson, Dr. Hampson.
Canada got a tremendous boost during the unipolar moment after the Cold War ended. And our soft power, if I could use that term, traveled well because it didn't encounter much resistance. International institutions today have become an arena of great power, soft power competition. I tried to underscore that in my comments about how the Chinese are extending their influence in those institutions. And simply put, we have to invest in our hard power in response to the first question I got, but we also have to invest in our soft power. And we need to get much smarter about it. It's not one or the other, it's both. And it's driven by, as I said, geopolitical forces. Yes, we're a middle-sized power, but many countries still look to us for leadership because there is a legacy there. And to come back to something Gordon said, our economic fortunes are in those parts of the world that aren't where we traditionally played, right? The Indo-Pacific being one of them. And they expect us to, be an active partner, not just in the new and emerging institutions of the Indo-Pacific region, particularly in Southeast Asia, where I'd say there's enormous opportunity for Canada, and there are democracies we can work with, imperfect democracies, but democracies nonetheless. Indonesia is one of them, where at one point we were one of their largest aid partners. They haven't forgotten that, but we sure have, right? And there's opportunity there. But we got to up our game. Hard power and soft power. And that means investing in both at a time when Canadians don't want to invest in it. And I think, part of political leadership is to say, as Gordon said, the world really matters to us in our prosperity and our security.
Thank you, Professor Hampson. Being a little bit, shall we say, generous on time today, because we do have a fair amount of time to us. So we'll go to our second round now, and Mr. Chong for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing. I want to ask a sort of a counterintuitive question and get both of your reactions. The narrative over the last 2 decades has been the ascendancy of the PRC and the relative decline of the United States. But what if we are entering an era where the opposite is happening? This past year, China's population dropped by 2.1 million people. At that rate, its population, and we know demographic decline is impossible to reverse. We've seen this in country after country. When you enter in that kind of population decline, particularly in a country like the PRC, which is not open to newcomers and is somewhat xenophobic in terms of its racial composition, that's almost impossible to reverse. So in 7 short years, the population will be down 1%. In 15 years, 2%. That's a pretty difficult demographic wave to counter economically. In addition to that, according to the World Bank, this past year, U.S. GDP per capita was $76,000. In the PRC, it was $12,720. And on those relative two bases, the U.S. economy in the last year grew at a breakneck pace off that much higher base. According to the recent data I've seen, on a nominal basis, U.S. GDP grew last year 6.3%, and China's nominal GDP grew 4.6%. Youth unemployment is skyrocketing. It is now higher than in Southern Europe, breaking through 20%, I believe. In fact, it was so high that I think last August, officials in Beijing said they were no longer going to publish the data on youth unemployment. And so when you put all that together, perhaps we are entering an era where the PRC is economically declining, and that may result in domestic instability. And so in that context, what should Western countries' position be relative to PRC? We've been in somewhat of a defensive position for the better part of a decade because of the increasing threats. We may be facing a China that is inwardly focused, as it was in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and vulnerable to domestic instability. And what should our position be relative to that, if that's the era that we're about to embark on?
May I? Mind if I go first? I'm thinking actually of a recent call by Mr. Ibbotson, which touched on those things. I agreed with his description of the problem. I'm not sure I entirely agreed with the conclusions. It is certainly true that Chinese population is irrevocably going to decline. There's no factory churning out 18-year-olds. Their percentage of the economically unproductive group, age over 64 or below 15. That bothers me a little bit because I'm over 64. Am I economically income? But they're spending over half of the money's being spent on robots is being spent in China. Can that compensate? Only partially. But if I look at Japan, which is a little bit further along that curve, I don't see the Japanese economy collapsing. What I see is a couple decades of very slow growth. The idea that China is going to outproduce, there was that time, you recall, when Japan was expected to be own the world. Real estate in Tokyo is worth more than all the real estate in the United States on paper. Not true. So what you've seen is slow growth and a flattening. China's not going to disappear. Things like youth unemployment, with a declining population of those of working age, those can be brought into balance. They're teaching the wrong skills. The parents want them to do certain things. Those aren't the jobs necessarily there for them. That's a mismatch of the labor market with the economy. That can be fixed. The U.S. economy is not about to collapse. It will have the largest economy for the foreseeable future. There'll be two great economies. But I'm skeptical about the decline. But we must be ready for whatever comes. I mean, you see, beware of the unexpected. The Chinese political system seems remarkably stable. It is remarkably stable. But to me, I've lived in communist countries on 3 different continents. To me, it's that strength of iron, not of steel. It can crack. And I served in Eastern Europe at the onset of the collapse of the Soviet Union. I didn't see it coming. My job was to follow the dissident movements of the politics, and I got it all wrong. So I'm wary now about getting things badly wrong again. But I'm skeptical of collapse. I think there's going to be slower growth and difficult growth. Quite frankly, and I've had this conversation with many Chinese, a China that had 700 million people would be a much more livable place than a place with 1.4 billion. And most Chinese agree. Easier in the environment, more space, higher quality of living. So let it be maybe less dynamic, not overtaking us all, but perhaps relatively stable at a lower level, or at least at probably not a lower level, but at a level where the gross GDP remains number 2 in the world.
Thank you, Mr. Chong. That's your 5 minutes and change. We'll now go to Ms. Yip for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you for coming. Professor Hanson, you in your opening statement mentioned that China is one of the largest contributors to the UN peacekeeping team. China has been participating in these missions for over 30 years. Why do you think they have taken such a role?
They've taken that role in part because for geographical reasons. Many of those peacekeeping missions have been in sub-Saharan Africa, which is a key, shall we say, area of investment for China under its development programs, its Belt and Road Initiative, its desire to acquire bases, not just on the eastern side of Africa, but now also the western side of Africa. And so it's been driven very much by self-interest. They have an interest as well in stability in the sub-Saharan continent. By the way, that serves our interests as well, but it's on their terms, not ours. But and it also comes back to the proposition about the Chinese desire for influence. And look at the influence and the reputational bounce we got when we were the big peacekeepers in the world back in the 50s and 60s. I mean, it defined us as a middle power. Well, guess what? It's doing exactly the same thing for China today, but not as a middle power, but as a great power.
Do you think they can maintain this level of participation in the current climate?
Notwithstanding the comments about China's population decline, absolutely. Absolutely. And they can underwrite the missions. I mean, we decided long ago that peacekeeping was too expensive for us. And there were others who could do it more cheaply. Well, it's expensive for the Chinese, but they're prepared to write the checks for obvious reasons.
Thank you. Professor Holden, you mentioned that Canada should invest more in soft power. Can you elaborate on that?
That might have been.
I think I used that term, but you said the same thing.
Fair enough.
Yes.
Fair enough. Well, I mean, influence comes in different ways, and we are but 40 million people. again, the heavy battalions are in Asia, where provinces of China, in some cases, have a population triple that. India, obviously, as well, Indonesia. So we have that, what I call the physics of power. We have that scale issue, which doesn't apply quite as much, and doesn't apply in Western Europe necessarily, but applies in spades in Asia. Plus, you have the tyranny of distance. So you have that great distance with a fainter footprint, and then you have the size, and that means expense. Overcoming that distance and also spending sufficiently and exerting influence at a distance is great, but we're going to be more affected by Asia than we will affect them, but that's not an excuse for inaction or not making that effort. The support for a bit of a bias here of our academic institutions operating abroad, it doesn't and shouldn't be all about government. Business as well can have an important role internationally. We are more or less invisible in the United States, but we're present, our firms in particular, in a large number. That's not quite so true in Asia. And distance is only an excuse sometimes. People assume, they look at a globe, and Australia's right next door. Well, I'm always happy to spoke to some Australians today at their High Commission. Sydney is further from Shanghai than Vancouver is. But the difference is, for Australians, the psychological distance is much shorter. In other words, they made a decision Asia is important to them, and so they engage, and they expect that to be the case. And they're present on the ground in large numbers throughout Southeast Asia in particular, but also in East Asia. For us sitting in Toronto, or even my home province of Alberta, China doesn't loom large. For the diaspora community, it does, of course, but that shouldn't be the only place where expertise on Asia or interest in Asia or a role in Asia should apply. It takes money, it takes sustained effort, and the key thing there, I'd say, would be sustained effort. Some of the issues in the past decades have been that we've had these episodic enthusiasms for Asia, and then some other crisis or some other situation comes along, and we move on. And that's noticed in those countries. If you visit a couple times and then it's 6 years since you were there, that will diminish any impact you have, whether it's soft power or just in terms of commercial promotion.
Thank you, Ms. Yip. That's 5 minutes for you. We'll now go to Mr. Bergeron for 2.5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Would you say that you see the recent election in Taiwan as a stabilizing factor in the region, or rather as a possible upheaval in the region?
Given the Chinese reaction to the election, I would say it's destabilizing. They were hoping for a different outcome. Does that mean that they're going to do what they have threatened to do? A lot of that depends on how the new leadership in Taiwan handles and manages its relationship with China, as well as the deterrent messages that the United States and its Western partners send to China. There are some strategic experts who say, well, we should get ready, given what's going on in the world, for a March or April military offensive that the Chinese will launch against Taiwan because they've simply had enough. I'm somewhat skeptical of that, but the other factor you have to put into the mix is the risk of miscalculation, what's sometimes referred to as the inadvertent escalation. It could be an incident at sea. There have been quite a few where American forces or the forces of their allies get into a shooting match with a Chinese vessel. A ship gets sunk. Then what do you do? And if there's a breakdown in communications, we've seen that scenario in 1914 with the mobilization and counter-mobilization of forces in a war that nobody really wanted. Well, I don't think anybody wants, and that includes the Chinese, by the way, to get into a war with the United States over Taiwan. They just have simply too much invested in the global economy and their own prosperity to do that. But if they feel the Americans are distracted, looking at the other way, they may be opportunistic. And as I said, there could also be, inadvertent actions resulting from loss of control over military forces that get you into a shooting war.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. Now to Ms. McPherson for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. This has been very interesting. Thank you so much. Dr. Holden, I'm going to ask you a question about Taiwan now, actually. What do you think the likelihood of an open conflict is in the near future, or the relatively near future, especially hearing from Dr. Hampson that we have a Trump, an election that is causing some mayhem. Obviously, the Middle East and Ukraine have U.S. interests divided somewhat. Just wondering about your perspective on that.
Well, I've been really wrong in my long career on certain things, particularly the Soviet Union. I could see the cracks in the wall. I thought it was all going to come down. I thought it was going to take 50 years. 18 months after I left my mission, it would all collapse. So take that as a warning. I have no magic crystal ball. I actually thought the Chinese reaction was much milder than I'd expected, that many people had thought, which tells me something, I think, about their willingness to pull a trigger in the near future. I thought it was relatively mild. I mean, they fly jets almost every day that are within sight of the island. I didn't see the strong reaction. They have a lot of tools that they can bring to bear, not just an actual invasion, but all sorts of gray area boycotts and shutting Taiwan out of markets. Taiwan's main market for their goods is still the PRC. Looking into the future, I think that Ukraine may have been a bit of a warning. When you start a war, it's not easy necessarily to conclude it. It doesn't include a time frame you wish or an normality that you would hope for. And an opposed maritime landing is one of the most difficult military exercises conceivable. There's no defense in the medium term, let's say a few weeks into a conflict, without U.S. assistance, direct U.S. assistance. But I think that also brings then another factor. Is Xi Jinping and the Chinese, are they willing to engage in a potential open military conflict with the United States? The number one job of the Communist Party of China is to stay in power. And yes, on that short list is unification, welcoming Taiwan back into the embrace of the motherland, but it's not number one. Number one is party maintains power. And number two would be then how they do that, mainly economic means. So yes, they want to do it, and if there was a moment of weakness, as Fence suggested, they might lunge forward, but we're not there yet. And I think right now, actually, a working relationship of some fashion with the United States, reducing the risk of open conflict and maintaining market access and a stable global economy is more important than bringing back Taiwan right now. And Xi's in a position where he can redefine those goals at any given time. It's really up to him in the Chinese media, and they have a big role in shaping public opinion. He's not saying in 12 months or in 24 months. Obviously, he'd like to do it sooner rather than later, but I see hesitation and caution.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson. Now, for our next round, we'll go to Mr. Chong for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just building on that, many people suggested that if there's something that happens with Taiwan, that the American-led response will be similar to the American-led response for Ukraine. In other words, it'll be non-kinetic, non-military. So in that context, maybe you could describe to us, based on your knowledge and analysis, the kinds of non-kinetic response that we would see, like sanctions, and how that would impact Canada and Canadian interests. Just say one last thing about that. The U.S. is relatively autarkic as an economy, exports about 1% of its GDP to China, imports about 1% of its GDP roughly in imports. China exports between 5 and 10% of its GDP to the United States consumers, and imports a lot as well, much more in excess of 1% of its economy from the United States. So it's much more reliant on U.S. trade than the United States. It's kind of the similar relationship we have with the United States. About a fifth of our GDP is exported to the U.S., and they only export about 1% of their GDP to us. So in that context, with an American-led economic response to a threat to Taiwan, what is the impact on our economy and our interests?
Well, there are two questions there, and one comment I would make is that Taiwan has a dual importance to the United States. One is as a democracy, and that's the values proposition. But the second is as the world's dominant maker of computer chips. I think the Americans have woken up, and others have woken up to the fact that it's not good to have a single source of supply there, and so they're making a very active effort now to diversify. And so in economic terms, and particularly technological terms, Taiwan is going to be a diminishing importance in the technology frontier.
I guess what I'm asking is, we enacted almost all the same sanctions the European Union did when it came to Russia. That was easy for us to do. Two-way trade investment between Canada and Russia was almost non-existent. Our repercussions here are small. European companies took a big hit, tens of billions of dollars in investments written off, family fortunes wiped out, a lot of pain. Well, to me, our relationship with the PRC and trade investment is similar to many European countries' relationship in trade investment with Russia. And so, I'm not sure. I guess what I'm looking for is, has anyone thought out the implications of a non-kinetic response to a PRC threat to Taiwan?
Well, to come back to the proposition about what would the Americans do if they impose sanctions, a lot depends on the nature of those sanctions. I mean, if it's trade restrictions, to be honest, we buy more from China than we sell, so it will hurt the consumer, because a lot of what we import are consumer durables, and the stuff we buy on Amazon, a lot of it comes from China. So we'll see a rise in prices for certain consumer durables. Is it catastrophic? No, because as Gordon said, the bulk of our trade is with the United States and with Mexico. I think what we might worry about, to be honest, is sort of a repeat of Trump 2 under a Trump administration, where they impose tariffs that are directed at China, but we become collateral damage because it's a general tariff against America's trading partners. And Trump has pretty much said that he's going to put a 10% tariff on all imports coming into the United States, and by the way, that includes us. If he then decides that he's going to make nice to the Chinese, as he did, and strike a deal on agriculture, that sideswiped us, or had the potential to sideswipe us, because it would be a preferential arrangement with the Chinese. If it's economic sanctions or financial sanctions, that would likely affect our investments in China, which are considerable, but they're not enormous. Speaking in terms of our global footprint, the majority of our investment goes south of the border, and that's certainly true of our financial institutions.
If I could just add a few words. I mean, I haven't done the math, but I think the effects of a thoroughgoing set of sanctions in the United States would be catastrophic in its short to medium term. It would be immensely inflationary. And in many cases, the necessary inputs to manufacture would not be there. Magna alone's got 13 factories in China. You would find, we thought it was bad enough with the disruptions from COVID. That would be mild compared to the effects of a thoroughgoing effort to isolate the Chinese economy from the North American economy. Even Mexican factories very often have Chinese investment or Chinese inputs in them, trying to put together, even the U.S. defense industry gets alarmed every now and then when they find a chunk of Chinese chips or other pieces in their aircraft. I think there'd be a cascading, rolling effect. It'd be devastating for the stock market, inflationary, higher unemployment. Again, I haven't done the math, but my gut feeling is let's not hope we don't have to go there. But if we are, tighten your seatbelts. The effects would be very seriously felt across this country.
Thank you, Professor Holden. We'll now go to Mr. Cormier for 5 minutes or less.
Merci beaucoup. Merci d'être.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us this evening. And thank you for all of the expertise in your fields. When we were in our ridings, I met with a few groups, and we talked about the economy, and particularly in my region, as I've already said at committee, China is a partner that we can't avoid in New Brunswick for seafood exports, for example, and lobster. And we were talking about everything that was happening globally, and they're very concerned. And we also talked about the Indo-Pacific strategy. How can this strategy help New Brunswick exporters, not only in the fields that I just mentioned, fish and seafood, but businesses in our region who can have a not a custom strategy, but at least could address the global situation currently? Do you think the Indo-Pacific strategy could be a solution that might help our companies to diversify their exports? How do you see this strategy? When I look at the Indo-Pacific strategy, I don't see details that can apply directly to the situation in New Brunswick, but in principle, we need to deploy more efforts to help seafood exporters, but it's not necessarily limited to that. One of the measures that could be taken is also politically difficult, and that is more Chinese investment in Canada, in the Atlantic provinces. But I note now, recently, and my institute has done a lot of studies on this, there is a much lower level, even if something is not strategic, perhaps in the agricultural sector, there is certainly no great risk. China is the second largest economy in the world, and for the provinces and the entire country depend on exports. Canada has a history of luxury with exports to Europe, the United States, places with values that are relatively aligned with ours. These countries have institutions that are similar to ours. Asia is different, especially China. But in my opinion, I think we need a more sophisticated policy on investment, because now I agree that every Chinese investment should be vetted carefully. They're a net benefit to Canadians, but now I see that the answer is almost always no, even if it is something that is strategic. And frankly, a Chinese investor in New Brunswick has to follow Canadian rules and legislation, and provincial legislation as well. And so if they do so, I think that we can find solutions that are in the interest of both parties. But currently, politically, it's very fraught with the general public. Even if we had an Indo-Pacific strategy and there was a great diversification of markets, do you really think that we could go without China when it comes to economic exchanges? Either of you?
I think when it comes to the sort of Indo-Pacific strategy, the real question is, what are we selling?
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, our comparative advantage comes from selling commodities. When it comes to China, we don't need free trade agreements to do that, because the price of commodities is set on global markets. And that, by the way, also applies to the wheat we sell to Indonesia. I think we're the largest supplier of wheat to Indonesia. So we're not competing with the Chinese. We're exercising good old Ricardian comparative advantage. And so I just don't see China as a competitor.
Mm-hmm.
And as we've seen before, if the Chinese, as they did with our beef and pork and canola, decide to put sanctions on us, well, there are third parties that we can going to buy it from us over the Two Michaels affair. So,
thank you, Professor Hampson. Now, in the time available, we have time for one question and one answer from each party. I'll call upon Mr. Kimich, Mr. Fragascatos for one question, and Mr. Bergeron and Ms. McPherson. So, Mr. Kimich, it's your question.
Thank you, Chair. So the question is as follows. In the Indo-Pacific strategy, it talks about reviewing all mechanisms and structures between Canada and PRC. So I want to ask about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Professor Hampson, you mentioned that the PRC's intention is, it's building these replacement institutions to replace the Bretton Woods institutions. So Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the government invested heavily into the bank and called it part of its foreign policy strategy. Now it has regrets. In June, it announced last year it was freezing cooperation. No announcement since then on what's going on and whether they will pull out or not. Was that in the best interest of Canada? Is the AIIB a replacement institution to try and push out Bretton Woods institutions? To you, Professor Hampson, and to you, Professor Holden, as well.
Brief answer, please.
Very brief. Yes, we did the right thing, because we woke up to the fact that the Chinese are calling the shots in the AIIB, and we have very limited influence there. And so if you want to play their game, keep your membership, unfreeze it. If you don't want to play their game because it's not advancing your own national interests, then suspend it.
If you're going to cancel it or freeze it, better if they're not gone in the first place. However, I would note that while the Belt and Road is a totally opaque organization with no governance that's visible, that is a scale that's at least 10 times the size of the AIB, the Belt and Road is a far more challenging and difficult institution. AIIB was an effort to try and create a counterpart to the Asian Development Bank, relatively successful and more admirable, I suppose you could say, than the Belt and Road. But if you're going to freeze, if you're not going to be there constantly, better to not start in the beginning. I don't see the gain in going in and then pulling out. Better to have stayed out. I'm not sure there's enough common ground to have gone in the first place.
Thank you, Professor Holden. Mr. Fragascatos, one question.
Both of you mentioned BRICS. How worried should we be about the fact that it has grown in membership? Where is this going, and how should Canada respond in working with others or taking actions on its own? What do you think?
Well, I wouldn't be losing sleep tonight over the BRICS, but I might 5 years from now if it expands in the way the Chinese would like it to expand. In the written remarks I submitted to the committee, I raised some of the flags that are out there about the BRICS. But I think and some of the countries that have joined, I'm not sure we should be worried, to be honest. They're not a club that we would necessarily want to be in. But I think we should be concerned that the BRICS are responding to a frustration with the existing global machinery of international governance. And part of that frustration is born out of unwillingness on the part of key countries. We're not in that group, but unwillingness to allow for greater reform of those institutions. And what should we do? We should be pushing for the reform of World Bank, IMF, giving developing countries who might want to jump over to the other side a bigger voice.
Thank you. Mr. Bergeron, one question for you, sir.
20 years ago, Chinese intelligence agents were described by CSIS as involved in economic espionage, and in 2002 they talked about Mandarin in the media and trying to influence the diaspora. And in 2010, they reported on an increase of intimidation and interference. There's a growing tendency over 20 years. What did we miss? It's a constant challenge. It's the simple fact that even in the last 100 years, the objective of intelligence concerns the diaspora, where they are more at ease with those who speak Mandarin, and there's a certain feeling in the Chinese government and a number of Chinese governments in the history that someone who is Chinese is always their citizen. They're not technically citizens, but if someone has a connection, they can be influenced. And they must have a certain allegiance and respect to Beijing. And that is very difficult to fight. Much of the diaspora is interested in their country, and like other ethnic minorities in Canada, they're interested in their motherland, but when there is an intelligence service with the capabilities and the will to control the diaspora, even if it's a very small minority of that diaspora that is interested in that, it's something we must monitor closely. But did it get away from us? No.
Yes. You pull it up and it comes back. You pull it, it'll always be like that. They will continue to use their power in the diaspora to follow their own interests. It's naive to think it's going to stop. You won't be able to stop it. We're a very minor influence. We have to continue to combat it and to be aware of it.
Ms. McPherson, one question.
Very much, Mr. Chair. One of the goals of the Indo-Pacific strategy is to expand our diplomatic relationships in the Indo-Pacific. What does China think about that changing dynamic, in your opinion, obviously?
Well, I don't think China lies awake at night worrying about...
They don't care.
...about Canada. Maybe they don't care, because they've got a 2000 foreign policy. They look at, they've got folks in their embassy in Copenhagen that speak Danish. So they, like any great power, they do everything in detail. So other people will notice. They really didn't like the fact that we call them a disruptive actor. They don't like when they're criticized. They have thin skins that comes out of regard. But the idea that they're somehow particularly terrorized. We've seen recent efforts in foreign ministers begin a dialogue again. They're there for the long term. Was it Talleyrand or was it Palmerston that said that France has no permanent friends, only permanent interests, and that's the way that China will continue to see. They don't like what we're saying now. They'll hope for to be dealt better cards tomorrow. But we have to remember, and there's one thing that bothers me about all of those strategies I've seen in the course of my career. We write them as if it's we that are changing things at that end. I can assure you there's a Canada strategy there somewhere, or North American strategy, and sadly, their influence on us, I believe, over time will be much greater than our influence on them. So it's really we can and should be influencing Indo-Pacific the way we can, but they're going to influence us quite profoundly. In the case of China, that, what I call again, the physics of power tilts in their favor.
Thank you for that. Gentlemen, thank you very much. I think out of your comments we'll be able to distill perhaps a way forward in the relationship that we could have, should have, hope to have with China as we proceed in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you for your time. You've been very